I am joined today by Tim Grant, father of Tom, who we recently spoke to from Proximity Hub to talk about that. And he said, "Oh, Andy, you've got to talk to my dad, Tim." So, hello, Tim, Tom's dad.
Hi, yeah, Andy, all right.
Yeah, well, I like to introduce where people come from because we get, I meet people all over the place, and I love how God connects the dots of people and opens doors to us of people. Because Tom said he's fascinating. He just has this amazing faith. You've got to talk to him. So here we are today.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, God's good, isn't he?
It's brilliant fun. So just give us a quick overview. You were just saying off air that you've just come from traveling everywhere. What is it you're doing these days?
um, yeah, historically, I've been an evangelist. We have done a lot of tent crusades. We're just, in fact, we're just selling our tents because we feel like it's a season that's come to an end for us, and we're passing them on to somebody else. But we had one tent that seated up to 1,500 people, and another one that seated 3,000. And we took those all over Europe doing events and evangelistic outreaches. So yeah. So that was historically what we're doing. I mean, more now I'm involved in helping training church leaders and equipping the church to share their faith. I believe that, that should be something we do. It's not an event. It's something we do as part of everyday life. We should be able to, we found the answer to major problems in life, and we ought to be open and honest about it. And so I'm trying to help the church lower the hurdle. They think it's a high jump, and I'm trying to tell them no, it's just a step. You hear what God says and you do what he tells you. And if you do that, you'll end up doing, being everything he wants you to be and doing everything he wants you to do. And that's really where we've been. I mean, I can't say we're particularly amazing. We've seen God do some amazing things, but that's primarily because I've sought to hear what he's saying. Christianity is a relationship. I often say that it's not about religion. Religion's all about rules and regulations. And I believe as Christians, we're called into a relationship with God through Jesus. And, often people will talk to God, but they don't give him room to talk to them. And, a relationship that only goes one way is not a relationship, So, God wants to talk to us. And if we listen to his voice and do what he says, then we will live the Christian life that he intended us to live. Those words of Mary at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, where she said to the servants, whatever he tells you, do it. And I think, if as Christians we got hold of that, we would our lives would be transformed. So, historically, I've done tent missions and evangelistic events all over the world. I think I've been to 54 countries preaching the gospel. More now is involved in training and equipping. We're looking to put some videos together later this year. I'm also involved in overseeing some churches in this country and abroad, so primarily places that we planted churches. When we first went into Eastern Europe with our tents, we really stepped into a revival. I remember the first event we did down in Bulgaria, we saw 800 people saved in 5 days.
Wow.
And the pastor came back to me and said, you've got to help us. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I had a church of 50 people. And he said, I have a church of 350 now, and I can't cope. And I went down to just to encourage him and help him disciple the new believers. And we'd been there in the summer, which was sort of 40 degrees, and now it was winter, and there was a meter of snow, and he had a building that held about 70 people, and he had got about 90 crammed into it. And all the doors and windows were open because there were another 200 people standing outside wanting to listen to the teaching. So, yeah, absolutely amazing. So we got involved in things, helping the churches down there grow and that. And that's continued. It's widened. As I said to you earlier on, we did some training, and that was put out on Bulgarian Christian television, which just sort of widened our audience to a much bigger audience. So, yeah. And God's done some amazing things. Originally I was a plumber or gas engineer, I had a building company, I had a computer company at one point, and then transferred to working for the church. Starting off, if you go back way beyond that, at 11 years of age, I remember being called into the headmaster's office with my parents. And the headmaster looked at my parents and said, "You have two wonderful children." And I'm sitting there thinking, "This guy's an idiot. My parents have three children." And then he looked at me and he said, "Then you have this one, and his brain doesn't work properly. And we don't think we'll ever be able to educate him to any standard. And if we can teach him a little bit of English and enough maths to count his wage packet, we'll hope to get him a very menial job when he leaves school." And at 11 years of age, they wrote me off.
Wow.
And then in my late teens, I met God. I had an encounter with God. And that scripture, Jeremiah 29:11, where he says, "I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope," transformed my life, because the world said I had no hope and no future. And God said, "No, you do. I've got a plan." And as I say, I ended up running three companies, pastored a church for 10 years that we planted, and then have traveled to 54 countries preaching the gospel since, written two books. How wrong could that headmaster have been? How narrow-sighted was he? And I think that's true for every one of us. God has a plan for our lives. And if we often think of that as being quite a negative thing and restrictive thing. But I think actually God's plan is that we get the best life that he intended us to have. So, yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. I had a similar experience at school. I remember going for my A levels. So if you're not UK, that's probably 17, 18 years of old or so. And I went to get my results for my three A levels. And I remember walking into the room. There was the head of sixth form and my form teacher and another teacher there. And the head of sixth form says, "Oh, wow, you did much better than I thought. I didn't think you get any A levels." And it was one of those, how do you deal with that? And the other teachers were clearly rather gobsmacked at what she'd said. Now, I liked her honesty because I thought I'd fail everything. But it's interesting how we can speak into a life, but you're the third person in a few days who I've met who's been told educationally, hopeless, no use, can't use them, no good.
Mm.
And yet you've gone on to do amazing things, which comes back to that thing about you saying that God's got a plan for us, because isn't it interesting? Deborah Green, Redeeming Our Communities, written off at school as well. Rocky is now 20 years old this year. What an amazing thing that does, reaching so many thousands of people around the UK. And yet she was written off. You were written off, and you've done three companies, you've helped people. Why is it, do you think, that God has the plan that perhaps others don't see? What's your thought on that one?
Well, I think the educational system, certainly historically, was quite narrow. And, their thinking was, we'll educate you in these subjects, and had quite a narrow viewpoint. Whereas I think God looks globally at us, the whole person.
Mm.
And because he loves us, he wants us to have good things in our lives, and he wants to bless us. And when he created us with a purpose. And his goal is that, in a relationship with him, we'll fulfill that purpose. And when we do, that is satisfying and fulfilling. People are looking for satisfaction and fulfillment in all sorts of things, in making money, in being successful by the world's view of success. But my experience has been that happiness doesn't necessarily come through those things. I've worked with some of the poorest people in the world and found them extremely happy people. They don't have all the things that we in the West think bring happiness, yet they have a joy. They might not have wealth, but they have a joy that we don't experience in the West. And I think in the West, it's become worse in some extent that we are constantly bombarded with advertising that says we're not good enough unless we have this product, or unless we have this, the latest piece of equipment. You buy your phone, and the year you buy it, the phone company tells you it's the best phone you're ever going to have. And a year later, they tell you it's complete rubbish because they brought out the new phone. So you never feel good enough. Whereas I think in a relationship with God, he's not about making you not feel good enough. He's about bringing you to a place where you have that best in life that he intended you to have, and he wants you to prosper. And I think that's why being a Christian is so life transforming, because you enter into the relationship. We were all created to have a relationship with God, and until we've experienced that, there's something missing in our lives. Yeah.
You used the word evangelism right at the start, and I thought it might be useful just to briefly unpick that a bit, because as a word, I think it does one of a few things. It either puts terror and fear into people of, I can't do that, or we think of Billy Graham, that's what evangelism is. And I think there are these different things we think of evangelism. But you've done evangelism clearly, quite a long time. You've been to lots of different places. How would you unpick the word evangelism to make it sufficiently simple and non-threatening to people to understand what is it that we're supposed to do? And you've touched on it a little bit, but I just wanted to draw that out a bit more, really.
Well, actually, I mean, Jesus said to the disciples, the Holy Spirit will come upon you and you'll be my witnesses. And I think we focus on evangelism. And I think a lot of the models of evangelism we either don't want to be, because, they're money grabbing, insensitive and nasty. We've all seen those sort of elements. Or there's something we feel we never can be, because, they're the Billy Grahams, the Reinhard Bonkers and all that. And so they're beyond their attainment. But all God asks us is to witness, and a witness is somebody who's seen or experienced something. And he says, I will make you witnesses. You'll be my witnesses throughout this world. So he wants us to share what we've experienced and what we've seen and what we've heard. And he says that to the disciples here, send his Holy Spirit to enable us to be witnesses. And that just involves us telling, at the very simple level, telling our story. How did you come to know God? What was your encounter that transformed your life? Because none of us are born Christian. It's the old saying, isn't it? If you're born in McDonald's, it doesn't make you a burger. If you're born into a Christian nation, that doesn't necessarily make you a Christian. I believe to become a Christian, you have to have an encounter with God where you that changes your life. And that's not a one-off thing. That's meant to be a continual thing. Giving, people talk about giving their life to Jesus, but that in a sense is a first step on a journey which will last the whole of your life. So evangelism, I always tell people, evangelism at its very simplest form is telling your story and your experience. To take it up another level is to hear what God's saying about the people you're spending time with, what you're talking to them, and he will tell you things that will help them experience him as well. I've seen that in all sorts of areas. God's challenged me at times. We were in Bulgaria and doing an evangelistic meeting, and there was a fight went on outside. We were working amongst Roma gypsies, and I think probably 800-900 people left the tent to watch the fight. It was like a school playground. Well, when you're preaching and 800 or 900 people leave your meeting, that's pretty challenging. And the missionary guy we were working with said, we get the worship band up. If we make a bigger noise than the fight, everyone will come back in the tent. And God says to me, no, there's a lady here who's blind in one eye. And if you pray for her, I'll heal her and everyone will come back in. So I told this to the guy, and he said, Tim, don't give me that nonsense. Let's just get on and get the worship band. I said, no, let's just fight. So, and I looked around the tent, and there were about 100 people left in the tent, and 38 of them were my team. So I knew none of those were blind in one eye. And so I just I said, well, I can't see this blind person, God. And I heard this very clear voice in my head, well, I can. So in the end, I just sort of said, well, okay, is there someone here who's blind in one eye? And this little lady got up, and she was hidden behind one of our guys. He was quite a big guy. And she came down the front, and she had one eye with a beautiful iris and a pupil, and the other eye was completely white. No iris, no pupil. And I started to pray for her, and I heard this voice in my head. It wasn't a booming voice. It was just like a whisper, what you doing? So I said, I'm praying, Lord. And he said, I told you to heal her, not pray for her. And I said, well, how do I do that? He said, put your hand over the blind eye. So I put my hand over the blind eye. He said, tell her she's healed. So I'm going, you're healed. I said, what do I do now? He said, take your hand away. I said, it can't be that easy. And I heard this voice in my head say, well, unless you take her hand away, you won't know it's that easy. And and then I heard this voice in my head say, "And you look awfully silly standing at the front of this meeting arguing with me." So I just took my hand away, and the lady had an iris and a pupil and screamed, "I can see!" And eight, 900 people plus came running back into the tent, and I continued preaching. So I think, it's just if when we're in a relationship with God, He talks to us. And if we will do what He says, that's when it gets exciting.
I was going to come back to that bit because the fact that a lady could see out of both eyes is stupendous. It's just fantastic. It's something we read in the Bible. We think, oh, it can never happen. It's the olden days that used to happen. Healing still happens today, absolutely. But the bit that really got me was the obedience of you to do that. I've got a friend. Every time I said thank you for doing that, oh, I'm just a servant of God. I'm just a humble person. And yeah, but you still have to be willing to listen
Absolutely.
to God and do something and share that encouragement to me. Oh, yeah, but I'm just doing what I'm asked. Yes, but not everybody does, which is
No.
coming back to your point.
Yes, I think absolutely. I think that's it. I mean, I used to say to my wife, and she'd tell me off about say all the time about it. Used to say, "Well, I'm just too thick to argue with God." And I said the trouble is most Christians have lots of arguments. God says do something, and they think of 100 reasons why they shouldn't do it. I perhaps have got one, and I give my one reason to God, and He gives me the answer, and that's it. I've got no more arguments. So at that point, you're left with one thing: you either do what He says or you ignore it.
I want to come back on the one reason why Tom said I needed to speak to you, because he spotted there's something in us as a family that's sort of similar to something you did. Because in 2004, we prayed to God, Lord, we want you to teach us faith. It was a very small prayer from us, bigger than we realized at the time, because it's one of those, and I describe it, I could see God saying, okay, let's go. We sold our house. It took a year. We lost our daughter in the middle of all that. We didn't sell a house, even though it was sensitively priced in a really popular area, until I got on my knees before God and finally submitted to what my wife had said. You don't need money to launch a business, which is what we were trying to do. And I said in my head, without the money from the house, we can't sell a business. The day, the moment, the hour that I said, okay, we don't need money to put into a business was the moment we got a phone call to sell the house for the asking price immediately. Now, Tom said, oh, my dad did something like that. Because apparently you sold your house for your church and then moved in with your pastor or something similar.
Yeah, we were the church we were part of at the time was outgrew all the local halls that it could meet in, and there was an old cinema in the town, and they decided that God was saying buy this cinema and turn it into an auditorium for the church to meet in, and it seated about 1,300 people when it was completed. But as a church, we were encouraged to pray and ask God how much we should give, and my wife and I prayed. And we used to have a habit of it's on major things. We'd pray separately, and then we'd wait till we got an answer, and then we'd share with each other what the answer was. And Kim was actually expecting Tom at the time, so she was 6 months pregnant with Tom, and the figure I said to her, what figure have you got a figure? And she said yes. And I said, well, tell me what your figure is. She said, no, tell me what your figure is. So I said, well, I felt God told me that we should give £10,000. And she said, that's exactly the figure I had got. And at the time, she was cleaning the kitchen cupboards, and she lifted her head up and banged her head because it was exactly the same figure.
Wow.
Now, I knew in that moment we would have to sell our house. But Kim wasn't in that place. So we tried extending our mortgage. We tried to get a bank loan. We tried all sorts of things. But because we didn't have £10,000, we had about £10 in our bank account. Anyway, in the end, we came to the conclusion together that the only way we could do this was sell our house. So we put a house on the market, and it sold relatively easily. The day came for moving. And during the time it had taken to sell the house, we had been told that God would provide us with a new home. And we didn't look to rent anything. We didn't look to, any of that. We just trusted that God would provide us with a new home. Well, moving day came, and we unpacked the house into a lorry. And then the movers said, well, where are we going? And we hadn't got anywhere to go. We just like, oh, right, okay. We'd expected God to provide, and at that point he hadn't. So our furniture was distributed amongst people's garages in the church, and a family in the church who we knew said, well, we've got one room, come and stay in that. And so we went and lived with this family in the church. We gave the church the £10,000, which was most of the equity from the house we had, and didn't leave us enough of a deposit to buy another house. And for 3 months, we lived with this family. And we're just trusting that God will provide us with a new home. Well, 1 week before Tom was born, we moved into a new house. We'd been given £25,000 in those 3 months. We moved into a bigger house in a nicer area. It was just amazing. And God provided, but it took, we had to step out. And it was way out of our comfort zone. And, people would say, oh, Tim's doing one of his crazy things, And people came to me and said, well, you need to rent a house. You need to do this. But I felt confident that God would provide at some point. And we didn't go around shouting about it. We didn't tell people we were homeless. My father realized we were homeless because we were no longer living in our house. We were living with friends. And he completely rejected me. He wasn't a believer, and he said, no son of mine makes his family homeless. We already had a daughter and another baby on the way. And he said to my wife, he said, you are always welcome with the children at my house, but don't ever bring that boy to my house because he's no longer a son of mine. And completely rejected me. When we moved into this new house, he turned up and he's looking around and he looked at me and said, did you rob a bank or something? How did you afford this house? And I said, well, we were given money. He said, you can't accept that money. You must give it back. I said, well, the trouble is, most of it came through the letterbox anonymously. So we agreed never to talk about it again. But God just provided supernaturally. And that's been our experience throughout life, that God provides. When we bought our first tent, it cost us £10,000. And we didn't have £10 in our bank account. And the church were going to buy the tent. And then at the last minute, they decided they didn't want to buy it. And to be honest, I was moaning and groaning because I thought, this is not fair. You're backing out on what you said you're going to do and all this. And I woke up one morning and God said to me, I didn't tell the church to buy the tent. I told you to buy the tent. So stop moaning and get on with it. So I went back to the elders and the trustees of the church and I said to them, look, I understand you don't want to buy the tent, but I don't want to be rebellious, but I think I should buy it. And to my surprise, they came back and said, yeah, we agree. And we'll loan you the money for 6 months to buy it, but you must pay us back in 6 months. So my wife and I ordered the tent. The church lender loaned us the £10,000. And we started doing events once it arrived in Britain. And within 4 months, we'd paid the church back the £10,000. 2 years later, God told us to give that tent to a church in Sri Lanka. And I was thinking, Lord, what? I don't think this is a good idea. We've really stepped out in faith and we're seeing God, you do great things in this. And he said, well, give it away. Eventually I submitted and sent it off, packed it up and sent it off to Sri Lanka. And then I've got people who've booked events with our tent for the next year phoning me up and saying, we understand you've sold your tent. I said, oh no, I didn't sell it. I gave it away. And they said, but you've got an event with us for next year. We've spent a lot of money already organizing this event. And I had this from several places, and you have no longer got a tent. I said, look, I'll turn up with a tent, even if I have to rent one, Anyway, I said to God, what do we do? And he said, you need to buy a bigger one. That wasn't big enough. So we looked on the website where we bought the original tent from. It was an American company. And that tent held about 250 people. And I saw one that held 350. It was modular and you could extend it to 1,500. So I thought, that's a bigger tent. So we bought it. And we put it up in the grounds of Waverley Abbey House at Farnham, where CWR used to be, I think. And we invited all our friends and leaders down to pray in this tent. And they walked in and we thought, they were going to encourage us and everything. And they walked in and they looked at this tent. And my pastor came up to me and said, Tim, what have you done? Where will you use a tent this big? And it was so big, his words echoed back from the other end of the tent. And I went home, and my wife and I cried that evening because we thought we had been, had gone too far. We thought, Anyway, the next morning I went down, picked up our mail, and there was Reinhard Bonker's newsletter. And I opened it up, and it was a little magazine. And I was flicking through, and I saw a picture of a tent. And the caption under this picture of the tent said, Reinhard's first tent held 35,000 people. And I heard God very clearly say to me, see, you just don't think big enough. And we ended up buying a 3,000-seater eventually, and have filled that on numerous occasions and seen thousands of people come to the Lord in both tents. So, yeah.
Wow. I love the heart of obedience. I think for many people it seems a bit crazy what you do and some of the stuff we've done as a family over the years. Some of the things we feel, well, God said this and we're going to do that. My dad, very similar to you, when we said we're going to sell our house, he basically rejected me at that point. And he died estranged from me, not seeing loads of miracles of what God had done in our lives, because Christian guy, but you don't sell your house. You need to be on the property ladder. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. But my wife and I said, God, we want to learn faith. And we are 20 years on. I think this is our 6th or 7th miracle home that we shouldn't be in, that God orchestrates in one way or another. And it's sad that he missed out on all the miraculous stuff that we've had going on. But
Mm.
God just wants our hearts. And this is the thing that I've been writing a book about 12 months of God's miracles recently for us as a radio station. And the thing that strikes me is God asks us to do stuff, but he always equips us for what he needs us to do. A friend of mine in America, a wonderful phrase, God's will, God's bill. But
Yeah.
this is what you're sharing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's been my experience. I've met lots of people who have said to me, well, God's told me to do this. And when he gives me the money, I'll get on and do it. And that's not been my experience. My experience has been when you do what God tells you to do, he gives you the money. I often think about, our royal family and our queen and that before she died. But she had a handbag and she didn't have any money in it because she knew that whatever she needed would be provided when she needed it. And we're part of a royal family. And our Father will provide whatever we need when we need it. And our experience has been that sometimes that's scary because it's the last minute.
Always.
My parents were getting quite frail, and the guy in the church, just about time we bought the 1,500-seater tent, and I was a little bit annoyed because not many people turned up to pray in the tent. And I'm driving away, and this guy in our church had built this retirement complex, and he said it was going to be affordable living, and it was anything but affordable living for the poorer people, and I was a bit annoyed with him because I'd sort of half thought that I would, buy one of the flats and or help my mum and dad to buy one of the flats and move them in there. Anyway, I'm coming back and I'm moaning at God about not many people turning up to pray in our tent. And God said, well, you didn't go and see Jim's retirement village. I said, no, but he said this and he said that, and it wasn't. And God said, well, you can't expect people to come and see you if you're not willing to, see somebody else's vision. So I turned my car around and drove to the retirement village, and I apologized for not going to their open day. And I said, is there a time to show me around? And he showed me around, and it was everything he said it was going to be. It was a beautiful place for people to end their lives. It was retirement. It was secure, gated estate and everything. And I'm walking out of the electric gates and I'm moaning and I'm going to God, that's everything he said it would be. And I can't afford it for my mum and dad. And God said, well, what do you want? I said, well, I'd love for my parents to finish their lives in this beautiful complex, And he said, well, what do you want? I said, well, I'd like to be able to afford to buy them a flat. He said, well, go and buy them one. So, but before that, he asked me a question. He said, are you a son or a slave?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, I thought we're bond servants of Jesus, and all that. But suddenly something whirled up in me and it said, I'm a son of the living God. And he said, well, start acting like one and go and buy the flat you want. So I walked straight back into the complex. I got a hold of Jim and I said, Jim, I'd like to buy one of the flats. And he said, well, which one? And I hadn't even thought that way because they were all different ones. And he told me that they were just selling the show flat, which came with lots of extras. I said, I'll buy the show flat. Well, when he told me about it, the price, I knew what we could get for my mum and dad's house. I knew how much I could add to that by extending my mortgage, and my sister would do likewise. But it still left us £25,000 short. Anyway, I just felt like, well, God will provide. So we signed the deal. I took my parents over. They loved it. We signed the deal to buy it for them. We put their house on the market. And Jim said, well, why don't you move your mum and dad in? So we moved mum and dad into the complex, and we put their house on the market, and it sold for exactly what we thought it would sell for. We were able to extend our mortgage. My sister was able to extend our mortgage, and we were £25,000 short. But my mum and dad are now living in the complex we can't afford to pay for. And there came the day where we had to sign contracts. And I walked into Jim's office, and he said to me, Tim, before we sign the contracts, he said, I felt God spoke to me and told me to give you a discount. Would you be embarrassed if I dropped £5,000 off the price? So I said, no, definitely not. I hadn't told anyone apart from my wife that we were short of money. And so I went home that day and I said, Kim, we're only 20,000 short now. And there came a month or 6 weeks later, I got called back into Jim's office, and Jim said to me, Tim, he said, when you came in, he said, God gave me a figure to discount. He said, I didn't do it. He said, would you mind if I dropped another £5,000 off the price? So I'm going, no, definitely not, Jim. I definitely wouldn't mind if you dropped another £5,000 off the price. And so we are now just £15,000 short. Well, we come to completion and we still haven't got this £15,000. And I think I'm going to, I'm in trouble. I'm going to have to go and apologize. I'll have to sell my house to pay for it, Anyway, I walk into Jim's office because he's phoned me, and he said, before we complete, can we talk? So I said, yeah. So I go into his office. He said, the day you came in and wanted to buy the flat, he said, God told me to give you £25,000 discount. He said, I didn't do it. He said, I cannot complete without doing it. He said, would you mind if I dropped another £15,000 off the price? I said, Jim, from the day I came in, I was £25,000 short. And I was wondering how I was going to tell you today that I hadn't got the money to finish the deal. And God just provided. My wife and I didn't tell a single person that we were short. We didn't tell my mum and dad. We didn't tell my sister. We didn't tell anyone that we had agreed to buy this flat, and it was more than we could afford. But God was on Jim's case, and, he discounted the flat, and my mum and dad finished their lives in that apartment. And, it was just beautiful. And they both came to know Jesus while they were there. They had been agnostic their whole lives. And when I became a Christian, they said to me, oh, well, your brother and sister went through this religious phase. You'll get over it. And that was a reaction. And then later in life, they realized that I wasn't going to get over it. And they said, well, that's for you, but it's not for us. And we just loved them and cared for them. And then while they were in that apartment, both of them came to know Jesus, which was just lovely.
That's beautiful. But the one thing that keeps on coming through everything you're saying is God asks us to do something, and then we do it. And it's usually the last minute, which I would definitely testify. We've been living by faith for a long time, and it's the same kind of thing. It kind of grinds you down. You think, well, how are we supposed to get through this? How do we get through that? But God asks us to do it. And when we are doing it, when we've jumped off that cliff without the parachute, it's at that point that God then can do what God does, because otherwise it's about what we've accomplished, and it's not about how great God is.
No, absolutely. Yeah. No, I think, people often sort of say to me, why aren't you better known? I said, because it's not about me. It's about God, and he's the one that does these things. I'm just the vessel that he uses. And I'm the guy that's daft enough just to hear what he's saying and trust what he's saying and do it. And that's been crazy at times. I remember I heard a guy preaching on blind Bartimaeus. And what was the last thing he heard before he got healed? And this guy did this with sound effects. Went, I thought I could do that. I could do that justice. So I took the notes and created my own word, and we were doing an evangelistic event, and I preached, with full sound effects. And at the end of the meeting, we opened it up for people to be prayed for, and this lady came forward and she said to me, "I'm suffering with tunnel vision." So I said, "Oh, what's that?" She said, "Well, it's like looking through straws or pinholes. And, so she said, "Can you pray for me?" So I said, "Yeah, I'll pray for you." So I started praying for her, and God says, "What are you doing?" So I said, "Well, I'm praying." And he said, "Well, you preached it, now do it." And I go, "Pardon?" And, I said, first thought went through my head was, did I brush my teeth? Second thought went through my head, my wife would tell you I'm directionally challenged, that if I spat, could I get it in this lady's eyes? And I imagined spit on her cheek, on her forehead, and so I put my hand on her head and prayed for her and sent her back to her seat. And I'm closing the meeting down, and I look out and I can see this lady squinting, and it's quite clear that she's not been touched at all. She's not healed, nothing. And I hear this voice in my head, which is, again, it's not a booming voice. It's just a thought that comes into my head. She's not healed. And I thought, yeah, I know that. And then the voice says, she's not healed because you didn't do what I told you to do. And I thought, yeah, I know that as well. And then the voice said, she might never get healed and have to live that way for the rest of her life because you didn't do what I told you to do. Well, now I'm under serious pressure. So I go over to this lady and I say, "Look, I know you're not healed." She said, "No." I said, "I didn't do what God told me to do." She said, "Well, just do it because I'm desperate." Well, I think you need to know what God told me. She said, "I don't care." I said, "You do need to know what God told me to do." So I told her, and then she used this little word that has so much meaning. She said, "Well, if God told you." Now, this isn't a booming voice. This is just a thought that went through my head. And she said, "Well, if God told you, spit in my eyes." And I'm thinking, did he? Didn't he? Was it my own imagination? And I still didn't trust my aim. So I spat on my thumbs and I rubbed it in her eyes. Nothing happened. The caretaker of the hall we were renting came up and said the ladies' toilets had been seriously vandalized. And this was quite a large lady. And I imagined that she'd gone into the toilets afterwards and kicked a hole in one of the toilet doors because she was so angry. And then she'd left, And I said to the caretaker, "Look, we'll pay for any damage, we'll just sort that out." Went home, had an awful night's sleep, very tossing and turning, asking God, "Why didn't you do? I did what you said. Why didn't you do something?" Eventually got dragged from my sleep very early the next morning by our phone ringing. We didn't have mobile phones. It was a static phone. Picked up the phone, and there's this woman on the phone, and she's screaming down the phone to me. And I eventually calm her down and realize it's the lady I've spat in the eyes of. And my first thought is she's phoned up to tell me she's going to sue me for spitting in her eyes. She said, "I've just woken up and I can see perfectly." And, yeah, it's scary at times, but it's about obedience. And I believe the Christian life is very simple. Hear what he says and do what he says.
I'll tell you the story that just came straight to my mind. I was at a Baptist church. There was a guy who was described to me, I was about 12, 13. He was described as a 55-year-old man who'd had a brain injury. So he lived as a 8-year-old boy. That's how he was, and that's how it is described to me. I just thought he was this lovely, sweet old guy. And when he became a Christian, he was baptized. And there was this thing, as a lot of Baptist churches would do, you just before you're baptized, you share your testimony of why you want to get baptized. I'll try not to cry as I say it. He said, "Well, Jesus told me he loves me, and I love Jesus, and he told me to get baptized, so I am, because I love Jesus." That's it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think, if we love Jesus and we'll want to do what that pleases him, And for me, I have to be honest with you, the Christian, I was a bit of an adrenaline junkie before I got saved. I was, in a group of lads, we all rode motorbikes, people thought we were a bit of a wild bunch. And, used to do crazy things. And, the more crazy it was, the more I enjoyed doing it. And I was absolutely addicted to adrenaline. And, and when I became a Christian, my friend said to me, but that's a boring life, and you're never going to sustain this. But actually, the Christian life is not boring; it's exciting. And when you live it the way we're meant to live it, it becomes thrilling. And to see God touch people's lives and transform them, whether that's physically, emotionally, or spiritually, is just an awesome thing to be involved in. I was in 1975, I was at a conference in Belgium for youth. So it's a few years ago, I was a bit younger. And Billy Graham was speaking, and we were asked if we'd go and be stewards at the Billy Graham Crusade. And I'm sitting there listening to Billy Graham, and God says to me, one day you're going to preach to thousands of people around the world. And I laughed. I just laughed my head off. It's not going to happen. And the next evening, I'm listening to Billy speak, and I hear this voice saying, one day you're going to lead the youth work in the church. And I laughed again, because our youth leader, as far as I was concerned, was next to God. And the third evening, I'm there, and God said to me, you didn't believe me the first night. You didn't believe me the second night. When you get home from this conference, you'll be asked to teach in Sunday school. And I thought, maybe that could happen. Now, I was out of a motorcycle gang and still had long hair and leather jackets and things. And I arrived at church the next Sunday, and the Sunday school superintendent came up to me and said, Tim, we've noticed you've got a gift and we'd like to use it in the Sunday school. I said, really? I said, what gift have you noticed? Because I'm thinking, well, what spiritual gift have they noticed I've got? And he said, well, we've got a group of young boys and they're completely unruly. But we've noticed whenever you go anywhere near them, they shut up and sit down and are quiet. And my gift was I frightened little boys. And I don't know who learnt more in those Sunday school lessons, because I knew nothing. So I'm reading the material and it's all new to me, and I'm learning by teaching them. And then when I was doing that, God said to me, will you now believe that you'll one day go around the world? And I thought, nah, it's never. A week after we got married, our pastor knocked on our front door and said, our youth leader has resigned. We'd like you and Kim to take on the youth work. And I suddenly thought, wow, the Sunday school happened, the youth's happening. And at that point, I believed one day I'd travel the world and preach the gospel. And 54 countries later.
How do we wrap this one up? What would you say to people who are listening to this saying, well, I'm a Christian, I'm living a life of faith, I go to church, I try and be kind and good and polite to my neighbors and the people I work with, and I obey the speed limits, and I'm doing all these things I can, but I just don't think that I'm supposed to talk about God to people I meet in my workplace, in my home, in my club, in my cricket club, and even in the church. How would you encourage them, really simply, to be able to take that step of obedience to what God is asking specifically them with the gifts he's given that individual? How would you encourage them to just go for what God's asking them to do?
Well, I always say to people, that scripture Paul writes, he says, always be prepared to give an answer to those who ask you for the reason for the hope that you have. And my belief is, if we are living the Christian life in relationship with God, that is noticeable by people around us, and they will ask questions. If they're not asking questions, the question you have to ask yourself is, am I hiding that relationship? Have I put my light under a bushel? Because Paul seems to say the natural outworking of living the Christian life is people will ask you about your faith. And that's certainly been my experience. And they will ask you why. I was in a restaurant just recently, and this lady, the waitress, came up, and every time she dropped food at the table, she's staring at me. And we were in Switzerland, and I couldn't speak to her because she was French speaking. I don't speak French. And I said to my friend, I said, why does she keep staring at me? He said, I think she fancies you. So I said, be real. Come on, I'm an overweight Englishman, And so I said, when she comes back to the table, can we ask? So she comes back to the table, and I say, excuse me, do you mind if I ask you a question? She said, yeah, what? Please ask away. So through my friend, I said, why do you keep on staring at me? She said, you have beautiful eyes. And I immediately was reminded of that Shakespeare quote, which is, the eyes are the windows of the soul. And I said, well, that's because I've got a beautiful soul. And she said, what do you mean by that? So then I told her and shared my testimony with her and told her that God loved her and cared for her. But it was because she saw something different about me. And just by asking a simple question, it opened up a conversation. We ended up praying for her because she was unwell. And in this crowded little restaurant, absolutely jam-packed full, we're praying for this waitress, and she starts getting slain in the spirit. And I'm trying to hold her up. She's wobbling around here, there, and everywhere. I think she falls over. She's going to wipe out 5 or 6 tables. And so I'm holding her up as I'm praying for her. And eventually she sort of stabilizes and she says, what did you do to me? She said, this amazing experience. I felt this power flow through me. She said, wait here. And she disappears off and she comes back 5 minutes later with a younger version of herself. And I realized it's her daughter. She said, do what you did to me to her. So I take the daughter's hands and start praying for her in the restaurant. By this time, everyone's staring at us and watching us in the restaurant. And I pray for her. As I'm praying for her, God said to me, she can't have children. So I look at this girl and I said, God's going to give you the desire of your heart. You'll have a baby. And I pray for her, and exactly the same thing happens to her. She starts wobbling and sliding all over the sofa, and we're desperately trying to keep her standing up because she's going to wipe out all these papers. And she looked, she's crying at this point because it's right. God said she wanted to have a baby, and she can't have babies, and He's healing her. And then I look at the first lady. I said, well, don't you need to get on with your work? Aren't you going to be in trouble because you're spending? She said, I own the restaurant. So I think people notice something different about us. I remember reading about one of the great 18th century evangelists, I think, and he'd walk down the street and people would come out onto the street and kneel down and give their lives to Jesus as he walked past their houses. And as an evangelist, I thought, this is a great idea. I said, God, I'd love to be able to walk down the street and people just come out of their houses and give their life to Jesus. And God said, well, it's not going to happen. So I said, why that? He said, you never walk anywhere. So I said, okay, every Sunday morning I will walk to church. So I'm walking to church, and I get to church and I'm helping set up PA and all that sort of thing. And this lady walks into the meeting, she's talking to our stewards, and suddenly she screams and points at me. She said, it's all his fault. So I'm looking, I said, excuse me, madam, what's my fault? She said, you walk past my house every Sunday morning. So I said, yes. She said, you look so much like an angel. She said, I had to follow you and see where you were going. And she followed me to church because she thought I looked like an angel. Well, there was a word of knowledge that Sunday morning for somebody who had a problem. And this lady came forward. My friend said, did she have an eyesight problem? Because she thought I looked like an angel. But she got healed and then she got saved. And I think we are meant to be different. We can't align with this world. And that difference should show. And when it shows, people will ask why. And then you have to be bold enough to say why you're different. But that, I think, I must have had that happen 6 or 7 times to me now, where people have just come up to me and said, you've got beautiful eyes. I was in a hotel in London just recently, and a lady said, you have a lovely smile. I said, that's because, God's inside of me and you can see him. And she just stood there at my table and talked to me about, God and everything. So it was, it's happening all the time to me. People are asking why I'm different. And I think, if we're trying to be like the world, we won't be different. If we're trying to not offend the world, we won't be different. We don't offend them on purpose. I don't agree with that, where people just go out and offend people. But we are called to be different. And when we're seen to be different, people ask questions. I've had it happen on the phone. I was on a telephone helpline to the tax office during the pandemic, and the lady on the tax office said, what do you do? So I told her I was a minister, and she said, what do you think of the pandemic? And she said, are you frightened? So I said, no. So she said, why aren't you frightened? I said, well, if I die, I go to be with my Lord, and that's a better place. So I said, death has no fear for me. And, I was just able to witness to her.
Wow. I think if I could sum this up, it's this way: you clearly have a passion for Jesus, but that passion isn't just inside you; it's something that you allow to kind of come out of you like a fragrance that people can smell. Tim, thank you for talking to me. It's probably timely for me as well, as much as anybody else listening, that God just wants our hearts. He wants us to be obedient. He wants us to work and walk with him. And when we do, that's when we experience the joy and the peace, which is what you've been so wonderfully talking about. Tim, thank you so much for your time today. I know you've got to get off and do something else. So I'm really grateful for your time. Tim Grant, father of Tom, thank you.
You're very welcome. And if people want to hear more stories, I've written 2 books. One's called Living Without a Safety Net, and the other's called You're Anointed with Power, which are full of stories of things that God has done. So, if you want to be further encouraged, they're worth getting.
Awesome. We'll link to those when we put this video out as well. Tim, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome. Bless you.
Here at Pure 24/7 Radio, we have had the privilege of speaking to some amazing people with amazing stories.
So I was already doing the work of an evangelist, and then I discovered that there was a term for it. And then I realized, I really wanted to learn more about the Bible and Christianity. So I went to theological college.
Most people think that my life as a marine biologist was spent riding on the back of a dolphin into the sunset.
That's my view.
Yeah, I did that. Never.
Been on the road 35 years, man and boy, doing magic and comedy to communicate the gospel. When I started off in 88, I was doing escapology. I kind of took that on from a friend of mine called Pete Gilbert, who was a real pioneer in creative communication.
If you have missed any of these interviews or would like to hear them again, you can. Simply head over to our catch-up section at www.pure247radio.org. That's www.pure247radio.org.